We have a new team of researchers that are now interested in learning more about the shroud and perhaps being able to apply some of our more advanced technology to having further in-depth understanding of the Shroud of Turin.
It's a head-to-head image of a man. He's naked with his arms crossed over his pelvis. He shows the wounds of crucifixion, also the wounds of being scourged with the Roman scourge, piercing in the right side. The thing that links him most closely to Jesus recorded in the Gospels is his head is covered with wounds that are the result of being crowned with a cap of thorns. There are multiple theories about how that image came about as a form of light, and of course you have to tie that to the scriptures where Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," and in other places in the scriptures where we saw Jesus transfigured before people's eyes and they saw him as if he were light. And that's really the goal, is to reach a younger generation of people who haven't heard about the shroud, as a way for them to explore and deepen their faith and ultimately end with an encounter with the risen Jesus.
So today we're joined by Nora Creech, who is not only a shroud educator, but she is also affiliated with Athonia. And to put it into context, I have to say Nora is so passionate about the Shroud of Turin, and her knowledge about the Shroud of Turin has great depths to it. And it was with her that I worked closely together to bring forth the exhibit that is now housed at the National Museum of Funeral History, entitled The Most Famous Burial of All Time, featuring the Shroud of Turin, a certified copy from the Bishop of Turin. And I look forward to telling you all about the journey and how the shroud came to Houston and is now showcased in our fine museum. But without further ado, Nora, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Genevieve. It's so great to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
You know, you're quite the educator, and when I met you, you were in part of your educational journey. Can you tell me a little bit more about your educational background?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I can go way back to when I was actually a high school student, and I was growing up in Colorado, and one of the members of my church was a member of the Shroud of Turin research project team. And so that was the first time I learned about the shroud as a teenager. So it's been a lifelong interest. And so I went through the years, completed my education, worked in industry, got some graduate degrees, and then I decided to go back to school to obtain a certificate in Shroud Studies. And that was in 2018, which is when I first met you. And the certificate is offered online in English from a university that's located in Rome, Italy. So it's the Regina Apostolorum, which it means Queen of the Angels, and it's a pontifical Athenaeum. So it's affiliated with, it has the imprimatur of the Pope for the teachings that they provide. And so the Shroud Studies course is a Post Baccalaureate certificate, and it's offered through the Science and Faith Institute of the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yes.
I think you need an education just to learn how to say all of that, correct?
It is, yes.
Yes. So you have such a vast educational background. How long would you say your educational journey about the shroud has been?
Well, as I mentioned, I became interested as a teenager back in Colorado when the Shroud of Turin research project was actually taking place in 1978. And so it's been a lifelong interest. And then when I had my own children and they were going through catechism at church, I started feeling like they needed something to help them connect what they were learning in their catechism class to science, history, and then also to make the scriptures come alive for them. So I worked with a friend of mine and we developed a short class for high school students. And it was just a class on the shroud. And what I discovered was, especially for the boys, that the information in the shroud really resonated with them. It just brought home that our faith is real and it's supported by scientific evidence, and you can probe and question the shroud, and you'll still come up with more and more mysteries and more things that invite you in, but you will end with the conclusion that this is legitimate.
Wow. Yeah. I know that, I've been hearing lately, and I'll dive more into it later, that there's been a lot of buzz going on about the shroud now. And I almost liken it to saying that we have a new team of researchers that are now interested in learning more about the shroud and perhaps being able to apply some of our more advanced technology to having further in-depth understanding of the Shroud of Turin.
Yes, that's exactly right. And the shroud can take it. It's almost like an invitation. Come on, probe and explore and question and keep asking questions. The shroud encourages that kind of interaction.
I really like that perspective that you put forth, that bring it on kind of thing,
Hmm.
that test me and let me tell you what I really am. Yes,
Hmm.
definitely.
Hmm.
Um, so let's talk about a bit of the journey of the shroud. If you could give us some history on the shroud itself, historically, of course, for people who don't know what the shroud is, first of all, tell us, what is the shroud and why is it so significant?
So the shroud is a 14-foot plus long piece of linen, 3.5 feet wide. So it's a very, very large piece of linen fabric. And it's a special weave. It's called a herringbone weave. So it's a very particular, intricate weave that is very expensive and difficult to produce using ancient techniques. And there are many burial cloths in antiquity, but this is the only burial cloth that contains an image. And so that is what has made it such an item for scrutiny. So it has this very mysterious image. It's a head to head image of a man. He's naked with his arms crossed over his pelvis, and he shows the wounds of crucifixion, also the wounds of being scourged with the Roman scourge, piercing in the right side, and then probably the thing that links him most closely to Jesus recorded in the Gospels is his head is covered with wounds that are the result of being crowned with a cap of thorns.
Very interesting. And so they believe that this cloth then was wrapped around his body when he was placed in the tomb, somewhat of a burial ritual in wrapping the body with the shroud. And then somehow it was during the time of his resurrection, they believe that this image was then permanently burned into the shroud. And then when they went in to open the tomb, all that was there was the shroud itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the scriptures tell us that on Easter morning, Peter and John ran to the tomb, and we're in the habit of calling it the empty tomb. But in reality, what they discovered were these linen cloths that were in the tomb. And in John's gospel in particular, where he talks about the Athonia, it's a plural noun for burial cloths, and what they saw were these Athonia in the tomb. And so there was something very, very significant about this linen cloth. And John's gospel says he saw and believed. And so as a result of seeing these burial clothes, he saw and believed. And so what was it that he saw? So that is what the kind of the mystery is. And the question that you raised is, how did this image that cannot be explained by any modern scientific techniques, how did this image come to be on this linen fabric? And so there's various theories about it. Almost all of the theories include some form of light. So the low energy light that would not actually consume the fabric but would leave an indelible mark. And so what the scientists have discovered is that the image, it's a chemical change in the layer of the cell wall of the linen itself. And the effect of it is more rapid aging than the other linen around it that is not containing the image. So there are multiple theories about how that image came about as a form of light. And of course, you have to tie that to the scriptures where Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And in other places in the scriptures where we saw Jesus transfigured before people's eyes, and they saw him as if he were light. So the connection with the resurrection is obviously very close.
And so when you were explaining it to me, when I was learning about the shroud for my research in curating the exhibit that is at the museum, I kind of likened it to a bright light that happens so fast, like a lightning strike, right? That then permeates the fabric, and then the body is completely um, just like obliviated, right? By this bright light, the body gets obliviated, and then the image is left over, somewhat like the images that were left over from like a nuclear blast, right? The body is completely gone, but the image of that body laying there was still left on the ground because of the bright light from the nuclear blast burned that image into the ground, kind of like I think that it burned that image of Jesus Christ when that bright light of energy, completely obliterated his existing body that we know that we all have.
Yeah, so there's a couple of interesting points related to that. One popular theory is that the body became mechanically transparent at the moment when the image was formed, and that created a vacuum so that the fabric was sucked into the middle, and that is the moment when the image was formed. But it's not a burn. And the way that we know it's not a scorch, it's not a burn, because the shroud was burned. It had experienced fire damage in various times in its life. And when the shroud was photographed using different kinds of photographic techniques, the burned areas fluoresce in a particular way on the color spectrum, but the image area does not. So scientists have concluded it's not a burn or a scorch. So it's more like a rapid aging. But your point is exactly right, that the body is gone, and what is left behind is this mysterious image. The other thing about the image is it's unique from the blood. So the shroud is completely covered with blood. There are blood stains all over it. And the blood seeps into the fabric. It wicks up through the fabric like you would expect a liquid to do. The image, however, doesn't permeate the fabric. Again, it's just on the outer cell walls. In fact, it's so much on the surface that it's less than 2 nanometers penetration into the fibers. So I can't picture what a nanometer is. So the illustration that people have told me is if you take a human hair and you cut it in half and you discard one half and you take the remaining half and cut it in half again, it's less than that depth. That is how
Wow.
superficial the image is. So it's very, very significant.
So it doesn't go all the way through the fabric. It's just like a portion of that fabric has that. And as we all know, that blood is of a liquid. And if the fabric was in touch with this liquid, it would more than likely absorb it all the way through, but it didn't.
Right. So for the blood, it does permeate through the fabric, but the image is only on the very top surface of the
Got it.
fibrils that make up the fibers of the shroud fabric.
Okay, so the blood does permeate all the way through, but the image does not. Okay, I understand now. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Wow. So, in all of the studies of the shroud, you were talking about Athonia means burial cloth. So you talk about cloths as in plural. So what is this other cloth that you're referring to?
So in the Gospel of John, he talks about that the burial shroud was lying, and then there was another cloth that was folded up and was separate. And so what scholars believe is that this other cloth that was folded up and separate was what is known as the Sudarium. And so that is a word that it comes from sweat. So imagine if you wore like a handkerchief around your neck for a hot, sweaty day and you mopped up your sweat with it. So like a large rectangular cloth. And the thought is that when Jesus died on the cross, we know the Gospels tell us that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pontius Pilate and asked for permission to take custody of his body for proper burial. So during that time, which could have been about 45 minutes, it's thought that his face was covered with this sweat cloth or Sudarium. So after he was dead on the cross, and this was put over his head, as we do today, when somebody passes away, we cover their face. And that's a symbol of respect. And it also protected his loved ones who were gathered at the foot of the cross from seeing his face in death. And so this Sudarium has been in Spain. The provenance of it is known all the way back to the 600s. And it's been studied in comparison to the image on the shroud. So the Sudarium has no image, but it does have blood and sweat, and then also pleural fluid that came from his mouth and nose and ears after death. And so the stains from that face cloth have been compared to the stains of the same body fluids that are on the shroud, not the image, but the liquid fluids.
Just the stains. Okay.
Yes, and so there's a correspondence that if you overlay the Sudarium with the shroud image, you can see a correspondence to those stains. And scientists have calculated that the Sudarium covered the same face within a matter of moments as the shroud did. So the Sudarium was not on his face at the time that the image was formed. It was folded up and in a separate place in the tomb. So in John's Gospel, he uses this term Athonia, which is a plural noun, but it's kind of like how we use the word linen. So we might talk about our linen closet. And so that's all the linens that are in there, but it could also just be a singular closet. So it's a noun that's used in both of those kinds of ways. There were potentially other linens as a part of the burial, which I know that you know about as an expert in how people are buried. So there could have been a chin strap around his chin to close the mouth in death. So that could have been staying in the same place it was when he was put into the tomb on Friday night. There also could have been, I actually learned this from you, that sometimes the thumbs are tied together so that the hands stay crossed. And so there could have been some of those linens also there. And then there could have been a strip that secured the linen of the burial cloth to the body, because the image is the legs of the man of the shroud were bent. And so it appears that there was a strip that secured the back of the linen to the back of his legs. So there were multiple cloths in the tomb on Easter morning.
Yeah, very interesting. And we talk about the legs being bent, and we believe that the legs were bent because rigor mortis had already begun to set in, thus causing the legs to have a bent up position, as well as when he was on the cross after he took his last breath, just the weight of his body then also would force the legs to bend too, and thus the rigor mortis setting in that particular position.
Yes, and you have the beautiful bronze sculpture in your exhibit that shows the body as it was recreated by an artist, Luigi Enzo Mattei, in death, in the repose of death. And so not only are the knees bent, but the head is slightly tilted down. And it actually looks like maybe there was a pillow behind his head, but there wasn't. It was because in death, his head came down, his chin rested on his chest. And so his head is raised in the sculpture that you have. And that is because of the impact of rigor mortis.
Correct. Yeah. So very interesting when you start putting all of the facts and the details and pieces together, that truly, even for myself, I remember when I began working with you, and I went to the Museum of the Bible to begin learning all of the important people in the shroud world, and learning more about the shroud so that I could curate a very factual exhibit. I remember looking at the shroud probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 times, and I just could not see the image. I really couldn't. And I don't know how many times you had to take your finger and point things out to me and really draw his image out to me on the shroud. And of course, now I can't unsee it. I can never unsee it, which is fabulous. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the shroud, a lot of people sometimes they'll say stare into this 3D this image, right? It's just a bunch of blocks on a screen, and they say look into it, and something will pop out at you, right? Have you ever seen any of those images
Mhm.
before? And there's some people that just say I can't see it no matter how many times I look at it. But I think the shroud at times it's like that for people. I don't know how many times I look at it, I still can't see what you're seeing, right? But I think we've done a fabulous job in the exhibit through the backlit images that is there to really help you see the image more clear. And if you could take that, what you see in the black and white backlit, and then visually transpose that onto the shroud, the image hopefully will present itself to you. And then you'll find yourself never unseeing it again.
Well, you put your finger on one of the great mysteries of the shroud, and that is when it was photographed for the first time in 1898. It was discovered that what you see with the naked eye actually is more like a photographic negative. And so in your exhibit, you have what are photographic negatives, but the negative of the shroud image is actually more clear and easier to see. And luckily, you had the foresight to have both of those in your exhibit. So you have the beautiful life-size replica, which shows what the shroud looks like today. If you could go to Turin and see it in person, it's what you would see. You have a beautiful, perfect replica. But as you said, it's very, very difficult to see with the naked eye. It's difficult to understand what you're looking at unless somebody explains it to you. But right next to your replica, you have the beautiful black and white images that you were fortunate enough to purchase from Barry Schwartz before he passed last year. And they're beautiful photographs that show the shroud image in a photographic negative. And of course, one of the great mysteries of the shroud is how is the photographic negative more clear and easier to understand than what we see with the naked eye?
Yeah, and hopefully maybe with technology moving forward, we could learn more about that. And we also have a legend underneath the shroud itself to help you better understand what you're seeing as well, because you also see the repair patches from the burns that the shroud suffered in a church fire, and so the shroud. If you think about the history of that cloth and the amount of travels that cloth had endured in its lifetime, and the fact that it is still in the state that it is, to me makes it a miracle in itself that something so fragile can still be maintained and preservable basically, and still comes out and makes a show to the public from time to time. And I think it's very interesting to learn that when this shroud is chosen to come out to public, and again it's part of the preservation of the original shroud, um, there's certain times that this comes out. Can you expand more on the history of the shroud and what it means to us and how it becomes so significant to the exhibit that we have today?
Okay, yes. So you mentioned a lot of things there. One I want to follow up on is the age of the shroud and that it is still in such remarkably good shape, but it has been in multiple fires over its history. And in the one of the most significant fires in 1532, the shroud was folded up and it was stored inside of a reliquary box or a metal box in a chapel over the altar. And the heat from that fire was so extreme that it melted the metal, and that molten metal dropped onto a corner of the shroud and burned a hole all the way through the fabric. So it was patched afterwards. And so for a long period of time, almost 500 years, those patches were an important piece of the shroud. They were removed in 2002. So now those burn holes are just simply holes. But what happened as a result of that burn was that the shoulders of the man of the shroud were lost in the image. And miraculously, the face and the body were not damaged at all, but the shoulders were completely lost. And you mentioned at the very beginning that now the shroud's been in the news. And one of the big reasons it was in the news was because AI created an image of what the man of the shroud would look like based on the shroud image itself. And for me, the most exciting part of that rendering from AI was that the shoulders were recreated. And so
Oh.
I just thought it was so beautiful. The face that AI created is beautiful, but then also to see that body image intact, that was really marvelous to me. And that's one of the treasures of modern technology, that we're able to do that. But you asked about the history of the shroud. So I mentioned that fire in 1532, but the history before the shroud in recorded history, in written history, goes back to the 1350s. And before the 1350s, the historians are actively working to try to trace the history of the shroud from the time of Jesus' resurrection in around 33 AD until it shows up in a small town in northern France called Lire. And it was owned by a French knight, and he was a very prominent knight, and he was in service to the King of France, and he actually died in battle defending the King of France. And his family owned the shroud and put it on display, but they would never say how they came to own it. So there's a period of the history of the shroud which is murky, and people are still trying to put that history together. One of the challenges of putting it together is it wasn't called the Shroud of Turin. It was called various other names. And so historians have to go back and look for something that they don't know what it's called in order to piece together the history. And then they also have to connect the link to what it was called in ancient times to what we today know is preserved in the cathedral in Turin. And that's why we call it the Shroud of Turin.
Interesting. And tell me again, what were the significant events that happened throughout time that they felt that the shroud was important enough to be part of?
Do you mean since it was discovered in modern history?
Yes, how it came out for like I think there's been then pictures of it being shown at weddings, pictures of it being coming out as a sign of faith during wartime and pandemics and calamities. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is?
Sure. So, as I said, it shows up in recorded history in the 1350s. And over time, the ownership passed to the Savoy family. And the Savoy were the ruling family from southern France and northern Italy. And so they had the shroud as kind of a dynastic symbol. So it's kind of like saying they had the right to rule because God had favored them with this most sacred relic. And so for a period of years, the shroud traveled with them as they went from castle to castle to castle. They took the shroud with them. They would put it on display to say, look, we have the right to rule divinely given. So they finally built a chapel for the shroud in Chambéry, France, and that's where that terrible fire occurred in 1532. And subsequent to that, they decided to move the capital of the Savoy to Turin. And so they built a palace to show their sovereignty. And then they also built a cathedral, and that's to show that they are divinely selected by God to be rulers. And in between the palace and the cathedral, they built a chapel. And that chapel is known as the Guarini Chapel, and it was built specifically to house the shroud. And so the shroud was moved there in 1578, and it was upon the occasion of a visit by Charles Borromeo, and he's now St. Charles Borromeo, and he was the Archbishop of Milan, and he made a promise that if Milan was spared from the Black Plague, that he would make a pilgrimage to venerate the shroud and to praise God for that. And so that did happen. And so instead of Charles Borromeo traveling over the Alps to Chambéry in France, they moved the shroud to Turin into the beautiful Guarini Chapel, and Charles Borromeo went there to venerate the shroud. That's a long story to say that one of the most famous engravings that you're referring to is an engraving which shows that veneration. And it's a beautiful engraving. It's actually, there's one in the United States. I think there's only two known to still exist. And it shows St. Charles Borromeo in the center of the shroud, cut with archbishops and bishops and clergy all surrounding him, and then the shroud unrolled in front of him for that that episode of veneration. The Savoy family would use the shroud anytime they had a public event that they wanted to celebrate, like a wedding or a baptism, or to commemorate somebody's passing. So the Savoy family used the shroud throughout their dynasty, and they would bring it out and allow people to venerate it. And something that always surprises people is that the Savoy family owned the shroud until 1983. So it was not transferred to the person of the Pope until the passing of the last king of Italy, and that was King Umberto II. He was deposed during World War II and lived in exile. And upon his death, he deeded the shroud to the person of the Pope. And so at that time in 1983, it was Pope John Paul II. So the current owner of the Pope today is Pope Francis. I'm sorry, the current owner of the shroud today is Pope Francis.
Wow, that's so interesting, and to the fact that it didn't get transferred over to the person of the Pope until just recently, really, if you think about it. So, when they actually did the research, the what we would call modern day research back then, right? I believe it was correct me, Nora, what date did the STURP team go in? Real quick.
1978.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so when they did what we would consider modern day research back in 1978 by the STURP team, it was still under the ownership of King Umberto?
Yes, that's correct. So he's the one who gave permission for the STURP team. And let me just tell you a little about the STURP team because it was very significant. There were 24 researchers who actually traveled to Turin. The team was larger than that because there were people that weren't on the ground in Turin but studied the evidence afterwards. And it was an international group, but they were largely American scientists, and they were not on a religious quest. The entire objective of their mission was to understand the mechanism for how the image was formed. And so they had 5 days, 120 hours when they could perform non-destructive tests on the shroud. And they planned it out meticulously before they went. They used their time. They worked around the clock and performed studies that were a lot of things involving photography, x-rays, looking at the shroud under microscopes. And so 6 times microscopic photographs, 60 times micro photographs. And so there was extensive study done at that time. But then they brought all of their research home and they continued to study. And then they published peer-reviewed articles after 3 years. And their conclusion at the end of all this time was that it's not a painting, it's not a scourge, it's not a rubbing, it's not made by any known artistic technique. There's no paint, dye, pigment, there's no brush strokes, there's no directionality. And so they concluded that they can't say what formed the image, even after all of this multidisciplinary, extensive study on the shroud in 1978. The only other extensive study that's been performed on the shroud was in 1988, and that was when the shroud was owned by Pope John Paul II, and he gave permission for a small piece of the shroud to be removed and to be radiocarbon dated. And so they actually cut away a single sample, about 8 centimeters, and they cut that single sample into 4 pieces. They kept 1 piece in reserve, and the other 3 pieces were sent to different laboratories for radiocarbon dating. And often, if people do know anything about the shroud, this is what they know, is that the shroud was radiocarbon dated in 1988, and headlines around the world said that the shroud is a fake because the radiocarbon dating said that it dated between 1260 and 1390, which is a medieval date. And so for a long period of time, about 10 years, research on the shroud went quiet. And I think there was a little bit of mourning in the shroud community about this kind of devastating news. But subsequently, researchers started questioning, first of all, the procedure, because to do a good test, you need to have multiple samples. They only had 1 sample. And then when the raw data from that testing was revealed, it showed that the single sample was not homogeneous, meaning that from the one end of that 8 centimeters to the other end of that 8 centimeters, there was a 200-year difference in the date that was obtained by the laboratories. So that indicated that it was not a representative sample of all of the fabric in the cloth. So in 2019, it was published in peer-reviewed scientific journal. In fact, the same journal that published the original 1988 results, it was published that the sample was not a representative sample. And so therefore, the results of the radiocarbon dating cannot be considered as dating the shroud, all the fabric of the shroud. That should have been headlines.
So why do you think it is that there was a difference in time periods within the fabric itself? What caused that? Why would it be, let's say, 800 years old in the first, half of a centimeter closer to the center versus 20 years younger in a sample that's further away from the center?
Well, there's a lot of theories about that. So I can tell you a couple of the theories. One very prominent one is it's known that the shroud was in the court of the French monarchy, and that they had very, very expert people who could do what is known as French invisible reweaving. And so they had tapestries and carpets and things like that that always needed to be repaired. And so they had people who were expert in that. So there is a theory that perhaps that area had been repaired in the past using this invisible reweave that was prominent in the French court at that time. That's one theory. Another theory is that this is when you look at those engravings of the bishops holding the shroud when it was put on public display all these times, the corner where they took the sample from is exactly the corner that they were held gripping in their hands. So perhaps there was damage that affected it. Another theory is that perhaps the resurrection event itself changed the structure of the fabric so that you can't radiocarbon date it because the molecular structure of the fabric was impacted by that event. So at this point, we don't know. And until there is a way to further test, a way that's non-destructive, we won't have the answer to that particular question that you asked.
If anybody knows anything about linen, in my experience in being handling replica copies, the Barry Schwartz copy of the Shroud, as well as the copy that we house in our museum during the curation of that piece and getting it, basically pulled out to its full length and getting it prepared for mounting. If anyone knows anything about the linen, it comes off in these little strands, right? So the weave comes unwoven so quickly and so easily that I can see how the edges of the shroud itself could easily fray. And the linen could easily be pulled away. And so I could see why repairs would be made, because when you hold a cloth, you hold it at its corners. When you fold the cloth, you fold it from corner to corner. And you still hold those same corners to bring forth the cloth into yet another fold and another fold and another fold. So I can truly see that why those corners where they actually took the sampling, thinking that would be the least destructive portion of the shroud to be able to test, why there could be so much discrepancy in the testing results itself because of just the behavior of linen and how the humans hold a piece of fabric. So I can see where there can be a lot of discrepancy there. So let's go back to Athonia again. I know we keep bringing that word up, and so far we've talked about it as its interpretation of burial cloths. So we were talking about Athonia as the interpretation of burial cloths, but Athonia is actually an organization that you are affiliated with today. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about Athonia because they actually were the beginning of the concept of our exhibit. So talk a little bit about your affiliation, and then we'll dive into how they were the beginning of this journey for us.
Well, my association with Athonia is thanks to you, Genevieve. It really has been life-changing for me. It's brought me such great joy to be a part of this ministry and this mission, and it is because of you. So I'd love to tell that story, but let me just say that Athonia is a part of the Science and Faith Institute, as I mentioned, of the Regina Apostolorum, which is a university, pontifical university located in Rome. And Athonia was started by a priest named Father Guerra, and he had a mission of educating people about the shroud. And he wanted to do that education in a variety of ways, one being through exhibits, another being through educational programs, and then a third through ongoing research, conferences, and lectures with shroud experts. And so Father Guerra started this mission, and his flagship exhibit is in the Notre Dame Hotel, which is right outside the gate in Jerusalem, going to the Temple Mount. And so there's a beautiful exhibit there. And so that was sort of the beginning of the Athonia Association. And unfortunately, Father Guerra passed away rather suddenly. And Father Pasquale, who is a native of Barcelona, and he's a medieval expert, and he stepped in to take over the leadership of Athonia. And he's the one who's really expanded Athonia to have a bigger footprint around the world. And so he's the one that I actually reached out to when you and I started working together to help us to get all of the pieces together for the exhibit at the Funeral Museum. And so I got to know Father Pasquale quite well through all of the back and forth that you and I had. And then also Father Andrew Dalton, who teaches in the Shroud Studies course, and he's also an international speaker on the Shroud. He goes all over the world talking about the biblical tie of the Shroud to the scriptures, and how learning about the man of the Shroud can increase our understanding of the passion and death and resurrection narratives of Jesus. So they were really the heart and soul of Athonia. And as a result of working with us on the exhibit there in Houston, they asked if I would join them in their initiative. And I said, yes, I'm so honored to be a part of this. So that was in 2019. And subsequently, we've been working really hard. We've developed a traveling exhibit, and we debuted that exhibit last July 2024, at the National Eucharistic Congress, which was a big initiative of the Catholic bishops to reinvigorate the Catholic Church and to really emphasize the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And so we debuted our new Who is the Man of the Shroud exhibit at that event. And so since July of 2024, the interest in Who is the Man of the Shroud, our educational initiatives, and our exhibits, it's been kind of overwhelming, but also very fun to be a part of.
Yeah, so my introduction to Athonia is when I had met you after serendipitously running into Father Jared at the museum, and him bringing the concept, have I ever thought of bringing the shroud to the National Museum of Funeral History? I remember going, I thought that never left Italy. How would it ever find its way here to the National Museum of Funeral History? And where is the connection, right? After meeting you through Father Jarrett, the three of us sat down and we kind of had a meeting of the minds, and we learned of Athonia. We also learned that Athonia had what we call a turnkey exhibit, which would have, probably saved us a lot of time on curating the exhibit itself. However, the turnkey exhibit was very heavy on the educational panels, not so much of the actual artifacts themselves. And we didn't have creative freedom to perhaps tailor the exhibit, if you will, to better fit the footprint of our museum. And so Nora, you and I decided that we would embark on this journey ourselves to try and create the exhibit from scratch, mainly the design from scratch. But of course, we had all of the pieces and the education at our fingertips to be able to bring in all of the facts and tell the story that we're able to tell today through the exhibit. So that was my introduction to Athonia, as well as the wonderful book that they had written that really tells a good story of of the Shroud. And it's not a book of 100 pages. It's just a really nice pamphlet, heavy on the pictorials, which I actually love. um, and so it's so fascinating to see that how Athonia was Athonia was the beginning of our journey, and now it has become part of the journey. And I'm really excited to see how that relationship continues on and how the organization is able to really do some great work as the Shroud. That all of the interest within it is becoming more and more prevalent to everybody. But let's go back and talk about how we ended up with our Shroud that is featured in the exhibit. So that's a really interesting, exciting journey, because when I talked with you, Nora, and I said, well, if we're going to get a Shroud for our exhibit, I would like a certified copy from the Bishop of Turin, because I am very methodical in the pieces that the exhibit houses, and that it is as close to authentic as it possibly can be. So you were kind enough to write a letter that was endorsed by Cardinal DiNardo, who is the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of the Galveston-Houston area here locally. And he endorsed the letter that you sent on to the Bishop of Turin, requesting a certified copy of the Shroud. And to us, or we understand what the certified copy means, but to people who are listening, what would a certified copy entail?
So the custodians of the Shroud are located in Turin, and they are it's the Center for the International Study of the Shroud, and they are the custodians of it, and they also are the ones who provide the replicas that you're referring to. And the only way to get one of those replicas is for the ecclesial head of an area. So in the case of Galveston, Houston, it's Cardinal DiNardo, to send a letter vouching for the person who would like to receive it. And so in the case of the Funeral Museum, you'd already been vouched for by Cardinal DiNardo because of the beautiful exhibit you have on the burial of the popes. And so it was very easy to convince Cardinal DiNardo that this was a worthy place to have an exhibit. And so I think it was in 2019 we sent our initial letter, and we were planning to have our capital campaign kickoff in March of 2020. And we had scheduled Father Andrew Dalton to travel from Rome to come and do the kickoff. And they had received our letter about that same time. And then, of course, we all know what happened in March of 2020. The whole world shut down with COVID. We had a few meetings to talk about what should we do? Should we just have a Zoom kickoff, or what should we do? And we said, let's wait and we'll be patient. And so the years kind of ticked by, and I moved during that time. I mean, there were a lot of personal changes, and then there were some ups and downs. There was some discouragement, and periodically I would follow up about, hey, can we get this certified copy? And we still have the museum. We still want to put it in, and no answer, no answer, no answer. And I finally got very discouraged, and I told you that I'm going to make one last ditch effort. This is it. If we don't get a response, then I think we just have to move on. And I do remember telling you, we can get a copy off of eBay, Genevieve. And you said, no, we're not doing that. We're going to wait. We're going to be patient, and we're going to get the right one. And I remember very clearly it was the morning of Good Friday of the Holy Week of 2022. And the very first thing I did that morning, I opened my email, and I had an email from the center in Turin saying, we are providing your copy, but it's not the copy you requested. We are providing you with a very, very special replica. And this was one that was produced by a field of flax that was grown during COVID. And it was harvested using first century techniques. And then it was produced into linen fabric, again, using first century techniques. And then it was printed with a high definition image of the Shroud. So the copy that you have in your museum, there are only 7 of them in the world. The only other one in the United States is in Washington, D.C. at the Museum of the Bible. And there's one in Rome. There's one in Poland. I'll have to check my notes for where the others are, but it's very, very special. And we received it and we're overjoyed when we received it. And it's the centerpiece of the exhibit there.
And it's the whole reason why we were able to do the exhibit. It was truly a test of our patience and our faith and our hope. And it was a trying time. It truly was. I have to echo that in what you said. In almost nail biting, if you will, thinking like, oh, if we don't get this, the whole exhibit is off. And we've done all this legwork for so many years. But it really was a true testament to our faith and our patience. And it's cultivated into a magnificent exhibit. And we're so excited that we have it. But one of the things that now we're moving forward, right? We have the shroud, we have the exhibit. It's been now, this April will be 2 years since it opened. It opened in April 27th of 2023. And we were so excited to have it in our fine city. But since then, a lot of stuff has been happening around the shroud. And I think I just want to talk a little bit about that. We had a film crew come in to film the shroud just recently for a segment on the TBN network, and I'm really excited to see how that will come out. But in that process, I got to meet some wonderful people there. One of them, an archaeologist, who said that he has now been doing his own research and studies on the shroud. So it's interesting to see what we thought was modern day studies of the shroud back in 1978. It's happening again in our current time of 2024. He is, there's starting to be peer review. There's starting to be peer-reviewed journal articles that are starting to come out about the shroud now with the new studies that they're being able to do. So it's really exciting to see some of that. And I'm really hoping to be able to capture some of that and be able to bring it forth as more up-to-date information that we can add to the exhibit. And you talked about how AI was able to recreate the image that's on the shroud and fill in the shoulders, if you will. But it's interesting that we're using modern day technology of AI, but there's always been people who have recreated the image of the shroud through art, through oil paintings. And I have to say that we had a wonderful gentleman, Jason Carter, who has been a huge blessing unbeknownst to us, who had just recently dropped off some beautiful art pieces, historical art pieces of the depiction of the shroud through different time periods. And looking forward to showcasing those pieces for the public in a temporary exhibit. And so it's fascinating to see the shroud through different eyes, through different artists, and how it came out through their paintbrush. And that will be on display here at the museum as a complement to the exhibit, but it'll only be temporary. So we're really excited to share that. And so, Nora, I have to tell you, we could talk forever about this. And there's so many more elements that go on beyond just the shroud itself, that the shroud is the centerpiece. And there's all these extra layers that we could go into. I wish we had more time to do that. But I'm so grateful for the time that you've given. More so, I'm grateful for your knowledge and passion that you have about the shroud. But even more grateful that I'm truly, truly honored for your friendship, the work that we do together, and the people that I have met because of you. And I'm looking forward to see where this shroud is headed in the future. And so, we talked about some beautiful people that we met, and we we're greatly honored to have the scientists from 1978 of the STIRP team, Rudy Dichtel and the late Barry Schwartz, present at our grand opening, and to hear their stories firsthand. It was amazing. And so the follow-up in this month also, we will re-air the broadcast that we did, the podcast that we did with Rudy Dichtel and the late Barry Schwartz this month as well, so that Shroudies that are out there can continue to listen about that in which they love, and perhaps we create some new Shroudies.
Mm-hmm. That's the goal. And thank you for your kind words, Genevieve. I truly meant what I said earlier about I was launched on this journey because of you, and it's truly been life-changing. I've gotten to meet some amazing people through this journey, and I've also gotten to deepen my faith through learning more about Jesus through what I've learned about the shroud. And that's really the goal, is to reach a younger generation of people who haven't heard about the shroud, not for shroud knowledge as an end in itself, but as a way for them to explore and deepen their faith, and ultimately end with an encounter with the risen Jesus. So that's the mission. My elevator speech is that my goal is to make Jesus known through his shroud. And so I'm just so grateful that you've given me the opportunity to do that in all the work that we've done together.
Well, Nora, again, thank you so much. True honor. And I hope that people are listening has either learned more about the shroud that they never knew, got interested in the shroud because this is the first time they've heard about it, and definitely come and see it at the National Museum of Funeral History. So again, thank you, Nora, so much for your time, your passion, and your love for the shroud.
Thank you, Genevieve. I appreciate the opportunity.